many of my students have said now, Professor Clarke, you know that all people are alike, and you're dead wrong. All people are not alike. People are shaped by environmental influence. They're shaped by weather. They're shaped by the presence of food. They're shaped by the absence of food. They're shaped by attitudes that bred them into their society. Well, now, let's deal with this early African for all of the years before he knew that there was anything in the world called a European. Most of our radical activity had to be developed in trying to get this white monkey off of our back. We developed one kind of radicalism in building a new society without precedent. Without precedent, we had to develop another kind of radicalism to deal with the infusion and the coming into our society of people whose word could not be taken, people who did not respect our culture, did not respect our women, did not respect our family structure. So a special kind of radical had to be introduced to deal with this kind of invader. Now, in the United States, a radical had to be special again, based on the design of the country, the intention of the country. Because this country was designed for free, white, Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. Everybody else was out, including white women. Now, you have the illusion that this state started off democratically when it started off not addressing itself to the major issue. Excuse me, what happened to the water? The major issue of facing the country at the time was slavery. And this event made it a necessity to create another form of radicalism led by Frederick Douglass in the 19th century. My main point is to hook up Malcolm X with his intellectual and revolutionary antecedents. And the main revolutionary antecedents of Malcolm X is the black ministry and the black radical of the 19th century who brought us into the 20th century when radicalism began to be watered down and radicalism began to be compromised. Once again, looking at the radicalism of the United States and looking at how this country preserves itself, every time a member of an oppressed group, especially black, showed his people the face of power and what to do about it, he was either murdered, driven into exile, or driven to suicide. There is no exception. So any time any African person shows his people in this country the true face of power and what to do about it, guard him 24 hours a day and have someone watching the guards for fear they may not be honest. All right. Sooner or later, one of three things is going to happen to him unless you are on guard to prevent it. He's going to be assassinated, or he's going to be driven into exile, or he's going to be driven to suicide. Now, had you known this pattern in American history that goes all the way back where we are concerned, and had you began to investigate the mysterious death of David Walker after his appeal, the mysterious death of Booker T. Washington after the last 4 years of his life, he stopped catering to whites and began to raise some principal questions about the whites, even whites who gave him money. Then he was gone. And all the others, Monroe Trotter, supposed to have fallen off the roof of a house where he lived and where he was born and where he walked around as a child and knew every spot on that roof. Now, who in the hell would fall off a roof? They knew that well.
Yeah.
Then we understand that Martin Luther King was saved so long as he advocated nonviolence. But when he raised some principal questions about power, he was on a collision course with those who murder everyone who raises that question and shows his people the true phase of power. My point is that Malcolm X not only related to this 19th century radicalism, that he related to the 19th century radicalism in the African world and the radicalism in the Caribbean world, and that there was a period when the radicalism of the Caribbean world affected the intellectual wedding between themselves and those in the United States, and became one. Predating Pan-Africanism about 100 years before anyone began to use the name Pan-Africanism. But now, going back in history again, looking at the radical factor in our history, I have said that we had 3 golden ages. Ages of great prosperity. We had 2 golden ages before we saw the Europeans. We had another one after the rise of Islam, disrupted by the Arab slave trade, but we had it in spite of the Arab slave trade that most of the brothers, or practically all of the brothers, don't even want to talk about.
Yeah.
Now, how is it, and what kind of people are you to have had 3 golden ages, and you might have a 4th one, when there are people who've lived and died without having one? What's so special about you? And what I'm trying to point to is what is special about you is your ability to produce radicals who affect social change and who challenge the status quo to the point where they can bring about social change. And this radicalism started early in our history as a people. Now, we began to challenge the norm. We began to make changes and innovations in society that ultimately will change all society. Now, during the dynastic period in Egypt, the first dynasty, impressive with Nomar or Minak. The second, kind of a holding dynasty, housekeeping dynasty. That means they did not move backward or forward. The third dynasty, we would produce not only a great radical, but the world's first multi-genius who would make radical changes in the society itself. Imhotep, builder of the step pyramid. Doctor, the world's first physician, who lived 2,000 years before the Greek who's called the world's first physician. And if you read the Greek who's called the world's first physician, he said, I am a child of called Imhotep. In other words, I am beholden to the African who is the real father of medicine. And yet the Europeans insist on calling him the father of medicine and take an oath in his name when he, in his writing, told them, I am a child of Imhotep, the African. Now, my point is that Imhotep, in building the step pyramids, would set in motion massive building. In starting the concept of medicine and beginning, the first man to have performed an operation and gathering intellects around him, setting in motion the Egyptian mysteries and ultimately the great lodge at Luxor that the Arabs call Luxor, the Greeks called Thebes, the Africans called Warat. Then he began the concept that would lead ultimately thousands of years later to the concept of higher education. And that men began to gather and to talk about social change and social preservation. And they began to prepare leadership so well that the nation was never without a supply of thinkers, and that this was done with so much uniqueness. You would go into the school to study at the age of seven, you would study 40 years, and most of the time you would never see a book. And when you come out, you was a physician, an architect, you almost anything you needed to do in order to maintain a nation. And you was a principal thinker, a great teacher, and an oracle. And went out to benefit an entire people. I'm saying that this was a radical step forward that got underway the radical activity that brought into being a nation called Kemet, later SAAMR, later Rites. The Jews called it Mizoram. The Greeks called it Egyptus, that was later abbreviated into Egypt, that the ancient Africans never called their country Egypt. My main point here is that without any precedence, African radicalism was set in motion and social change came into being. Of course, there was writing. Many books came into being. Finally, someone brought these papyrus of these different books. There was a papyrus plant that out of which came the words was paper, but that's another lecture. But when it was all pulled together into a single work, the best of it, it was called the Book of the Coming Forth of Day and Night. And because the Arab grave robbers were robbing African tombs for manuscripts and gold, whatever they could get, some Arab took this big manuscript out of a tomb, and the British who wanted to buy it asked him where he got it from, and he pointed to the grave he had robbed. He said, I got from those dead people over there. They call it the Book of the Dead. Got nothing to do with the dead. It has to do with life. Now, in this book, you have literally an anthology, but coming together many books dealing with social thought, social change. Out of this book and from these books in a collective way came many of the stories that ultimately went into the making of the Bible, a book that was belatedly arrived at in human history. People think the Bible has always been here, it's always true, it's God's word. If man is God, then you're right. Man put it together. And man changed it many times to suit himself. I'm saying it was a great illustration of truth. It was lessons taken from Africa by the Hebrews, rehashed, some personified, to give you the illusion that they were a part of the event involved. Now, we see Africa as the giver. This is something else that the black intellect will not examine. They will not examine with any thoroughness the Hebrew entry for fear of loss of tenure and loss of reputation and loss of limb. They will not examine in depth the fakery behind and around the faith called Islam, the most unoriginal of all of the forms of religion, because it came into being so fast. It had to steal a few saints from here, a few from here, a few things. It had no original poetry and no original social thought. And they don't examine that within a degree, because they would have to examine the Arabs who faked it into being. They have to make a clear separation between Islam and Arabism, something the brothers are not willing to do. I'm not saying don't be a Muslim, but I'm saying at what point would they turn their eyes away from the Arabs and focus on great black Muslim thinkers who brought the religion into being, all radical? Want to relate Malcolm to radicalism within Islam, then you would relate him to a thinker like Ahmed Barber, who wrote 47 books, each on a separate subject, 2 books when he was in exile in Morocco. The last of the great chancellors at the University of St. Khoury at Timbuktu. Exiled in Morocco, he wrote 2 books trying to explain his people to those silly backward Arabs, and they never got the point then or now. And yet, you know all of the heroes and the litany of the kings of Europe, and most of the blacks who are Muslims never heard of Ahmed Barber. Never heard of the black radical warriors in the South, Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, called the Mad Mullah of Somaliland. These are black Muslims who fought to free their country from any form of domination. The great black Muslims of West Africa, Sekou Touré's grandfather, SAAMR, and a Muslim who created a separate form of Islam, Amadou Bello Bambara. He created an Islam that was basically anti-Arab because he thought they were the corruptors of Islam. This kind of radicalism we have not dealt with, and we have not dealt with the radicalism in the creation of the literature of ancient Egypt and how the Africans arrived at what to do. We have not examined with any thoroughness the works of Sheikh Anta Diop, when in his writings on the history of taboos, he showed you that many times Africans arrived at civil law based on what to do, based on what not to do. Now, if you look now at the negative confession, although you are only interested in the 10th commandment part of it, which Moses took, if he brought them down from the mountain, he had to take them with him because they were in existence 3,000 years before he was born. Moses, an African prince, born and raised in Africa, born in a place called Goshen, a radical thinker for his day. Now, when he was wanted by the Pharaoh and had to put some space between him and the Hebrews and his country, he took up with the Hebrews. Then he, in the language of the street, palmed off a deal on them. Obey my God, I'll be your leader. And what did he palm off on them? The concept of monotheism, the concept of the oneness of God as against the multiplicity of God. My point is that he was a radical thinker, but he took his cue from still a radical thinker, more radical than himself. Maybe in religion, the forerunner of radical thinker. Some people say that Akhenaten, who was Amenhotep IV, gave the world monotheism. They're wrong. Some people say that the Hebrews gave the world monotheism. They're still wrong. The Hebrews heard about it, and wrote about it, and personified it, and got themselves into the picture. But before their entry into Africa, they had never heard about it. What Akhenaten did is to deal with the corrupt ministry of that day, then restricting the travel of people in the countries based on the fact that God had limitations and that your God could only protect you in a given space. And all he did was to give them back what they already had. The fact that God was omnipotent, God was everywhere, God was in everything, and God goes everywhere. My point is that the beginning of African spirituality was a form of radicalism, because the Africans gave the world no religion. The Africans gave the world a universal spirituality. Foreigners, hypocrites, took African spirituality, misunderstanding it, converted it into cults and religions, and put one against the other, and tried to prove that each one of them were the favorites of God. Therefore, saying that God is love and God is merciful and God is kind. Then, when they said that they were chosen by God, those that they are God's favorite people, they're also saying that God has stepchildren, and God is a baby. If he favored one over the other. My main point is that in this universality of spirituality, God was in everything. God was in all life. God was in all forms. If you wanted to pray, you could pray to the wind because God was in the wind. You could pray to the river because God was in the water. You could pray to the tree because God was in the tree. But if God made man in his image, and the early Africans understood this, then God was a part of you. That if you turn inward on yourself and examine yourself, self-meditation and self-examination brought you closer to God. The when the African understood that, he really did not need other people to formalize his spirituality into something called religion and into denomination. It was a radical step forward because no one had ever done that. Okay, my main point is that this kind of radicalism guided Africa through the first and second golden age, and that Akhenaten came close to the end of the first golden age, and that the recovery of independence and the 1,000 years of peace and prosperity brought Africa another golden age, and that golden age did not end until foreigners came again. You must remember that Africa existed for thousands of years before any invasion. That the first invasion was 1675 BC. My main point is that radicalism within Africa itself expelled the invader, and that the second golden age began to peter out when the foreigners came again, not understanding African religion, not respecting African customs. First the Assyrian, 666 BC, then the Iranian, 550 BC, then called the Persians. And they were so brutal that Africans cried out, "Oh God, if you cannot send me a liberator, send me a conqueror who will show some mercy." Now you can understand why when the little Greek called Alexander, sometimes referred to as the Great, when he knocked at the door, he didn't have to knock very hard. He was like any other invader. He was a raper. He was a raider of the granary of Egypt to feed his soldiers. But he realized one thing, that Africa was the home of the religions of the Greeks. That African radical activity had brought into being basic religion. And all of this had happened before the entry of foreigners. That before the foreigners arrived, Africans had already embarked on a radical course. They had created one of the most intelligent systems known to the world, matrilineal. They knew then that if you had a god, you had to have a goddess. While Western man tries to defy nature, African spirituality was to bring man in harmony with nature. And bringing man in harmony with nature, he would bring man in harmony with his relationship to the woman who gave him birth. And because the African had no fear of women, before Alexander arrived, the African had created a system of lineage where the women rode at the head of her army. Women did not come to power just because they were women. They had to wait their turn like anyone else. But when they became head of state, they led their armies in battle other than send them in battle. They engaged in radical activity and social thought and equality. She can do a little book, The Culture Unity of Black Africa, is very good on this point. In parts of his book, Africa, the Politics of a Federated State, is also good on this point. In his book, African Pre-Colonial Black Africa, is good on this point. But a group of essays he wrote for the Journal of African Civilization, especially his essay, African Contribution to Civilization, the Exact Science. This points to African radical activity in the sciences before the European could make a bar of soap. What we need to do is to look behind this slavery curtain and see what happened to African people during this period of radical social change. And we need to understand the price Africa paid for internal weakness and how it had to deal with this weakness. The first invaders coming in 1675 is because an internal weakness developed in Africa, and Africans had to deal with that internal weakness and basically lost some of their independence while making the transition. Again, weakness set in, and people began to move into Africa, again taking advantage of that weakness. African people have always been the prize to be captured by other people, principally because we are the world's richest people. We have always had and still have things that other people want, think they can't do without, and don't want to pay for. If you understand this, you will understand why the Boers want to hold on to South Africa by any means necessary. Because when they left Europe, they were Soviet, religious malcontent, Calvinists. If you understand how the Europeans demeaned religion, you will understand that the Boers wasn't wanted when they left. And yet, being Calvinists, they belong to a religion that says that they are ordained by God to rule over the lesser breed. Mm-hmm. They've declared Africans lesser breed. This brings me to the 19th century and the examination of radicalism in the 19th century and how this 19th century radicalism relates to the antecedents of the radicalism of Malcolm X. Because his spiritual, intellectual, and religious cousins appeared during this period. People who would ultimately engage in activities similar to him, and that Malcolm X is the continuation of 19th century radicalism more than any other. He is a continuation of historical radicalism, but more directly, he is a descendant of 19th century radicalism. Now, how then did 19th century radicalism come into being? In the British Isles, British-controlled Isles, the British had brought basic white technicians to do work, to fix the sugar mill, to do the blacksmithery work, This was a lower class Englishman who had no appreciable status in England, because in spite of the need of the craftsmen, there was an English aristocratic class that had no great respect for people who had to earn their living with their hands. He was tolerated because he was needed. But in the West Indies, many of these same people, because the white face was at a premium, because he had a social status in a sea of blackness that he never would have had in England, he began to gamble too much, drink too much, and he began now with all the women, mostly black, he began to say yes to temptation, all those temptations. He began to pursue that temptation. And if you're going to pursue all of the female temptation you meet on the earth, you might as well be more successful than try to drink up all the water in the sea. It's an impossibility. You can wish the rest, wish up on it. You wishful thinking and go on your way, because it is impossible to partake of every single one that you meet. Well, some of them were just exhausted, some of them were broke, and some of them went back to England. But my main point here is that the African slaves began to do that work, and the British had brought furniture from England, saw wood. There were termites in the West Indies who would eat that saw wood for dessert. So they had to reproduce this furniture in the hard mahogany that was plentiful in the West Indies at that time, not plentiful at all now. So now you see the emergence of a craft class in the West Indies. You see the origin of the Caribbean free man. These people, free with the question mark, of course, began to engage in radical activity, agitating against slavery, began to bring into being revolt after revolt, until they had established a class of revolutionaries that the British could barely deal with. They had brought into being more successful revolutions principally because they could maintain something in the Caribbean islands that we could not maintain in the United States, and that was a culture continuity. The drum was not outlawed, and African religions, while not tolerated, were not stringently outlawed. So they could communicate with each other based on the African religion, based on the drum language that went beyond the tonal language. So you had a guarded island of freedom in the Caribbean islands. Now, in the New England states of the United States, many blacks brought in as slaves because slavery was basically a New England business, and this is another lecture we need to give, because most people think, oh, it is much more. The South had most of the slaves, that slavery was a Southern business. Slavery was not a Southern business. The Northerners sold the slaves to the North, to the South. And when the Northerners underwrote the abolitionists, the South said, you bunch of hypocrites, you sold me the slave, now you send these damn abolitionists around here to take the slave away. Now, I don't ever want to be on the side of defending the South. When they call the Northern a bunch of hypocrites, they were for selling them a slave and trying to take the same slave away from them and pretend that they're so goody-goody. Now, they were hypocrites, they still are hypocrites on the same issue of the relationship of African Americans to the rest of the country. My main point here is that out of this free class came thinkers, people who could read, people who could write newspapers, came a class of Caribbeans who affected intellectual wedding with a similar class in the United States. This is the origin of the 19th century radicalism in the Caribbean, in the 19th century radicalism in the United States. A same form of radicalism appeared in Africa in the almost physical radicalism in the anti-colonial war. And the verbal radicals didn't appear in Africa in any great numbers until close to the end of the 19th century. And this was the missionary trained radical who began to appeal to the conscience of the Europeans, forgetting that a person who invades your country, rape your women, take your resources, have no conscience in the first place. So now, dealing with this contradiction in Africa, the colonial wars, where they went military to the field, at the end of the 19th century in Africa, in West Africa, they began to produce men like Case the Hayford, great lawyers like John Mansa Sabah, a school of radicals coming out of Sierra Leone and out of the college called Forobe, now the University of Sierra Leone. In Nigeria, a series of radical missionary trade radicals who took them for their word. In East Africa, man, John Chilemwe, who began the radicalism in the Africa land. John Chilemwe had gone to Oberlin. He had studied Christianity. He took up with an African, who was a black American, and John Lynch. They would go back to Africa, especially Chris from Nyasaland, now Malawi. And they would ask the principal question of the missionaries. I noticed you living in big houses, we're living in huts. If we're all children of the same God, then our living quarters should be equal. Now, if you move into the huts, that's all right. Or we move into the big house. So long as we children of God have the same living quarters. If God gave you the right to have service, then I'm assuming that I have that right equal to yours. And not getting what the answers they wanted, they began to burn churches all the way into the Congo. Near the end of that century, there appeared among them a strange thing that we have not dealt with, a white black nationalist. John Booth. John Booth was from a dissident element of Jehovah's Witnesses. He told Africans that the white man can't be trusted. To his everlasting credit, when the Africans asked him, could he be trusted, he said no. Chilemwe and John Lynch brought off what is called the Nyasaland Uprising. Black radicals fighting against the Germans after the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 5 was set in motion a series of revolutions. The best known, the Major revolt in what they call Tanganyika. These Africans who go into battle, dashing themselves with what they call holy water that would deter a bullet. I'm not saying it did deter a bullet, but that's what they said. And they would dash themselves with water, major. This is called the Magi Revolt in Tanzania. In Southeast Africa now, Namibia, the Germans wanted to create a bastard race by cohabiting with the Heru woman. The Germans did not know that the Heru woman never cohabits outside of her group, not even with another African. See, while talking about looseness and primitivism, promiscuous in Africa, you quite forget that there were places in Africa where adultery could be punishable by death. There are people in Africa who have child marriages, sometimes 3 children before the actual marriage occurs with the approval of their respective families. There are also groups in Africa where the woman must bring virginity to her wedding bed. When you study the diversity of cultures in Africa, you will find many cultures using many different kinds of methods. But my focal point now is on the radicalness that appeared in Africa during that period. My main point is that at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, in Southern Africa, organizations that ultimately would lead to the finding of the first ANC. That the ANC faltered at first, stimulated by the visit of Bishop Turner that we'll come to a little later, an African who became a cop-out, John L. Dubé. And then he changed, he became such a cop-out, being the first African to go to a university in Southern Africa, Westwater, still in existence. And to impress his wife, sponsor us, he wrote a scurrilous book called The Black Man is His Own Worst Enemy. In order to atone for this later on, when someone showed him what a fool he was, he went from village to village, laying the foundation for the early ANC. The early ANC was no communist. It was a different organization that it had with the infusion of communists who may well be traitors to the ANC and who may well be informers to the South African white government.
Yep. Yep.
You got to walk very carefully when someone else is carrying your coat. Now, at the end of this century, an Atlantean brought into being a large trade union movement. His name, Clement Kadele. This was supreme radicalism to build a movement in Southern Africa with 500,000 members. Later on, Isaac Wallace would build a similar movement with a smaller number in Sierra Leone and parts of West Africa. A young radical, Casely Hayford, after the exiling of King Prempeh and after the last Asante War led by a radical woman, Ye Asante, Casely Hayford would start a demand for the return of the royal family and convert that demand into a demand for independence. When he died in 1931, he sent for his leading student trained to take his place, Joseph V. Danquah, to send for J.P. And he said, J.P., the mantle is yours. You do not understand that Africa has a custom of passing the mantle, choosing your successor before you die, and making sure that he's going to carry out the program you have designed and making sure that the people approve of the program and approve of him. All of this had been done before the death of Case the Hayford. But Case the Hayford, being the radical insane, one of bewhiskered Irishmen who thought that he was at least Jesus Christ, on some days he condescended to be Julius Caesar. Two nuts and two roustabouts, not even words like he said. But they have romanticized it. And Dickens spoke Tale of Two Cities, kept quite a lot also. And Ronald Coleman in jail. This better thing, this is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done. All of this movie fakery give you the illusion that a revolution occurred. The Rights of Man, a beautiful declaration, didn't help any French working class because the fight then was the maintenance of the slave system that helped everybody in France, because some of the work filtered down to the lower classes. Building the ships, purification of the sugar, sorting the tobacco. So the slave system had began to reconstruct and rescue the economy of Europe. Now the American Revolution, another phase, was an argument between two levels of the English, old and new, and slave masters. The founding fathers were all slave masters. Some of the great heroes of the American Revolution were slave masters. And some of the heroes were not genuine heroes. Of course, Paul Revere made the rise. And he might have made it for the reason you think he made it. But he was also a bootlegger warning other bootleggers hide this stuff before the British come and put a tax on it. He was right for that reason too. Now, I didn't say he didn't serve his nation, but he served his fellow bootleggers also. A lazy critter, a good craftsman, good tinsmith, but he was making more money selling the booze. Why should he work all day making pots and pans when he can sell a barrel of liquor and rum and get away with it? No, my main point is that during this period of revolution, you've got to look at the radicalism of Prince Hall. And you look at the Masons of today who have no relationship to Prince Hall, and they should stop calling themselves Prince Hall Masons because they don't have any of the principles installed in this organization by the radical Prince Hall. They told him if you're a preacher, you get respect. He became a preacher. They told him he got no respect. They told him if you own property, you get respect. So he owned property. Nothing changed. They finally told him you've got to have an organization. And he began an organization after the British refused to give him a charter. Some Irish and some Scotch, those peeved with the British, gave him an authentic charter. And what did he call this organization? The Masons, the Black Masons? No. He called it the African Lodge. And the first thing he established in relationship was a community school. Useful thing. 19th century, early part of the 19th century, the massive slave revolt, Gabriel Prosser, 1800. Then McBeasy, 1822. Nat Turner, 1831. David Walker's appeal, and here we got to look at David Walker, because if you read David Walker's appeal and read Malcolm X's message to the grassroots, you will see a similarity. I'm saying here you have an authentic forerunner of Malcolm X in David Walker and his famous appeal. You have a man setting in motion at a time when there were other blacks, some ministers, some not ministers, telling the Africans to compromise. The Africans in the United States to compromise. David Walker said, lift up arms. He called for an armed struggle with the slaveholders. He called for the colored people of the world to rise up against the slaveholders. He had learned one thing that I personally would learn later on. Once you discover the unworthiness of people to rule you, your freedom began with this discovery. Now, in the midst of this, you have the finest example of a leader to emerge during this first half of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass was not a perfect human being, and too many times we lack the ability to extract from human beings the good that they can do without expecting them to be perfect in every way. He became too much a trapped by the Republican Party, but we'll talk about this later. The main thing is that a radical class of blacks did emerge in the appearance of modern Delaney, who went out to Nigeria, a place called Abeokuta, searching for a place for settlement. The argument over the American Colonization Society had occurred. Douglass was correct in pointing out that this society was ruled over by a bunch of whites who just wanted to get rid of blacks, especially the black free man, because Douglass said that maybe the slave would like to trip a little better. Why are you sending these black abolitionists back to Africa, these free blacks back to Africa, instead of sending some slaves, freeing some slaves and sending them back to Africa? It was a good question for the time, it's a good question for any time. Because that choice of who to go back told you that the American colonization was a white scheme to get rid of blacks. It will prove itself more glaringly to be subversive in black interest during the period of Abraham Lincoln, and we'll just come to that fleetingly later on. But I'm saying that the first half of the 19th century, with the massive slave revolt, with the society, was that period we can trace the radical antecedents of a Malcolm X. Using different words, men said different things. When the great minister Henry Highland Garnett had gone to Jamaica, invited by the Jamaican free men, we had heard that conditions in the United States had not changed. He thanked his Jamaican host and told them, I am returning to the United States. I'm not returning to ask for integration because I do not want it. I am not returning to ask for justice because I do not expect it. I am returning to the United States to devote the rest of my life to trying to tear that republic down. Black men don't speak that way anymore. We had to wait for a Malcolm X to emerge before someone said, either we be equal in the House or we don't care if the House stands. Then we have to tear the House down to get justice. Then this is as a consequence of the fight, because we should pursue our freedom by any means necessary. And when he began to tell animal stories, Malcolm X was going back to the African methodology of teaching. When he was talking about the fox and the tiger, when Elijah Muhammad looked at the spectrum of white oppression and said, that man's the devil. Now, Elijah Muhammad understood something which we do not still understand. Whosoever is in charge of the hell in my life is my devil. Symbols of speech. Now this is the way many Africans talk. So Malcolm X was not only in keeping with African folklore of teaching, he was in keeping with Caribbean folklore of teaching, he was in keeping with the world folklore of teaching. Because Africa illustrated stories by telling animal stories. Now let me tell you one to illustrate the point. It's a Nigerian story. An Igbo, told by the Igbo. A snake was riding down the road on a horse, and he saw a frog who shook his head in pity. Said, "Mr. Snake, you don't know how to ride the horse. Let me show you." The snake got down and let him gallop and show him how to ride the horse. And the snake got back on the horse and conceded that the frog could ride better. Then he looked arrogantly down at the frog, walking on the ground without any means of transportation, and said, "To know is one thing, to have is another." Now, don't worry because I said the animals talk. Did you understand what I said the animals said? Yeah. That's important. Because in Africa, you had talking animals. The African assumed that inasmuch as God had to make the waves and the ocean and the spring, they had some leaves and some other parts of the wood, he had to turn those brown. Way on the other side of the wood, he had to turn those green. Way on the side of the wood, one side of the wood, he had to start the planting season, and another the raining season. But maybe in his haste, he forgot to give the animals a voice. But the African gave him one. So the African walked down the street and sees a crocodile and says, "Mr. Crocodile, where are you going?" And the Africans began to tell stories of what the animals said. These were stories of wisdom. And these were stories illustrating lessons in the period when there was very few books. Now let me tell you another story that's so hectic, so old, if you don't know but one African story, I'm sure you might know this. How the spider got his small waistline. He was a chubby little fella, eating everything in sight. He heard there's going to be 2 banquets. near each other. So he tied a string on his waist on the right and a string on the left. So one friend, now you wait over here and pull the string when this banquet starts, and you pull the string when that banquet starts. Now you get the end of the story already because both banquets started at the same time. Both friends did exactly what they were told to do and start pulling out the string, and that's how the spider got his small waistline. Now, African housewives tell this story to their children right now. You can eat as much as you want to, but don't be so greedy to eat everything. But why couldn't you just say it straight away? Then it wouldn't be the beauty of the poetry. Because Africans like to illustrate the lesson before they say the lesson. They like to spell out the lesson. And sometimes I remember my mother, who I love like a deer, even today, and she would look at me with her hand on her hip and she didn't have to look the second time because I knew that hand would come down at a place where it wasn't unwanted, and I would feel something. And a warning was all I needed. So she had spoken without opening her mouth. So we began to speak in symbols. Now, my main point, I wanted to let you know that Malcolm X's story about the fox and the wolves and the snakes in the grass comes out of old African tradition, and there are certain things that come down to us through time and space and everything else. Years ago, I accidentally met Ray Charles here in Chicago. I said, Mr. Charles, I believe the secret in your singing, what makes your singing so distinctive, is that there is a protracted cry in your voice. And these are the wailings of the slave ship, coming down through the years, through the bloodstream, down through history. I meant exactly what I said. He said to someone, who is this crazy cat? I wish I could see him. He did not understand that our culture was inherited. There are certain things that come down through us, through time and history. And sometimes when you don't have an answer, you want to sound important while you're looking for the answer, and you want your listener to think you know the answer, you said this is genetical transference down through the veins. After that you got to look for the real answer. But this answer holds your audience for a while and gives you the time to do some more study. Okay. My main point again is to relate Malcolm X and his stories and his teaching method not only to ancient Africa, but to the teachings of the deity known as Jesus Christ. Now how can I do this? Easy. Because very often Malcolm X taught based on what was in front of him right then. He taught a lesson based on current reality. Now, to understand a Malcolm X, you have to understand this. Now, I have said in a previous place that in another time and place and under other circumstances, a Malcolm X could have been a king, and a good one. He could have made a nation, and he could have destroyed a nation. that he was the finest example of leadership to emerge from the working class in black America in this century. And he was clearer on more issues and came directly to the heart of more issues than any man we have produced in this century. He did not have the time to intellectualize around this issue. That he came from the lower depths out of the mire, and he learned from every step of the way things that he would apply later on. And what we need to look at is the circumstances in the United States that went into the making of his mind, and the making of his action, and his ability to not compromise in a given situation once he had arrived at an explanation. Let's look at the death of his father. These early years, the mangled body of his father, thrown on the porch literally by members of the northern Ku Klux Klan, his mother growing slowly insane, the children being taken away, his early years in school when teachers discouraged him from aspiring to anything higher than that of a carpenter, planting suspicion in his mind about what he could be. Then his gradual growth, never getting out of his mind the fact that he grew up in a society that was programming him to be a servant of the society other than to be a beneficiary of that society. Coming to live in Boston, then coming to Harlem, he would become both the servant and the user of that society. He would become a pimp. He would become a user of dope and a seller of dope. He would become a waiter and a hustler. He would become a petty gangster, as Big Red. Men would, again, one would fear him. He would go back to Boston where he would get arrested. And now we see, after a while, his making in the isolation of a jail, is being introduced to Islam by his relatives, brothers, his reading of the literature of Islam, his exercising discipline on himself by refusing to eat pork, his slow learning that became rapid learning, his ability to try to train himself with words, taking a dictionary and starting from A, which tells you a whole lot about misconceptions of education in the United States. His fascination for Elijah Muhammad before he had even seen him. His final emergence from jail as a Muslim, heading a mosque in Detroit, becoming active in Chicago, marrying, coming to New York. And I would meet him in 1958 after my return from Africa. I was head of an expedition called the African Heritage Studies Expedition, the first expedition of its nature in New York, and he was one of the exhibitors. And he came in because his group had stalls in the exposition. He would come in and see how they're doing, and he would come in and talk to different people. And he had said nothing to me other than hi, and to acknowledge the fact that I had done a good job at making sure that his people had good space while they were noticed by the different people attending. He let it go at that until a friend of mine asked his girlfriend to meet him there, and she was white. And she was standing talking to me, and he waited until she walked away and came over to me and said, "Who's she? That your woman?" Direct. No subtlety. That's your woman? Who she belonged to? She belonged to a friend of mine. He said, "That's the way they'll tell me, come by and pick her up." I said, "Well, I can tell you. I've been down that street, lead to a dead end." Then he walked away. That was the beginning of our relationship. I have not talked extensively about my direct relationship to Malcolm X, because after his death, so many phonies emerged as his friends. I decided that I wasn't going to get on this bandwagon. There was something genuine about the relationship between Malcolm X and myself. Malcolm X had a shallow cabinet of non-Muslims who gave him advice. He had a political man he would turn to when he had to make a political lecture. If he made a lecture on education, he had someone else to turn to. Only that person was the woman. All these people still alive now. None of them came out of the closet and say, "I was great on Malcolm X." All of them to assert him. Because into the world over. So he would call me, give me a folder on this, and he would send a brother around to pick it up. And one time, he had to debate two college professors on the Congo situation. He said he didn't get the folder until 7 o'clock. It was 9 o'clock when he started to read it. It was 11 o'clock when he went on the radio to debate for 2 hours on the subject. He said the main thing he read was a little pamphlet by Mark Twain, King Leopold's soliloquy, and a few of the newspaper clippings about wholesale murder in the Congo. No man could do more with little information than Malcolm X and use it correctly. He could box you into a corner and you wouldn't be able to get out. And the one thing he learned in a conversation with professors, always take the conversation into the area you have studied. And when they get into an area that you have not studied, go slow until you could pull the conversation back into the area that you have studied. He took that Congo situation and beat those people across the head for 2 solid hours, one being chemist class, and made them look like children. After this, I had a new respect for this man's mind. Finally, I got a job as advisor to NBC, a program they did called the Harlem Temper. Still one of the best early TV programs on Harlem, documentary. And Because I knew Malcolm X, I would go to the mosque, ask him to participate in the document, and he did. Not only participated in the document, he got one of Elijah Muhammad's sons that we don't hear about much, called Akbar, to also participate. He let us film inside the mosque and film a demonstration outside, in the street, on the outside, and he gave us priority for filming. I am advisor to the filming, and as a technical advisor, I have to tell the cameraman what shots are the most pertinent for visuals. And I was kind of pointing to the cameraman, take that, take that. And the black women were standing by, oh, at last, they're giving one of us a job in high time. And look, he's doing so nice at telling them white folks what to do. I became the cutest thing to them, you know. Why are you from? It is you mad. The important thing that Malcolm had opened that door for me, and we would remain friends. And the one thing Malcolm X did not yield on, he'd be very proud of me right now. But then, I was a pork eater. He said he would meet me sometime in the back of a restaurant in Harlem called 22. And he would have nothing but coffee because he's very careful about eating away from home. He would hit me on the back, he would have beautiful lobster, and he'd say, John, I'm going to give you 99. Why not 100, Malcolm? He said, you leave the swine alone, you get 100. Here you come with your pork-eating self. What you got for me tonight? I was going to have some notes and some historical things he wanted to know about or had not known. And he would read them and he'd integrate them into his talks later on. And Malcolm X was a stunning human being. It was a beautiful thing at that time. So I knew him through the last phase of his activity in New York, in the mosque. And when the tide began to rise against him, during the march on Washington, again I had a temporary job, a new wife and a baby on the way, so therefore I need money. And I had this relationship. He, Malcolm X, and a lot of people don't even know this, started a newspaper called Mr. Muhammad Speaks in New York City. This is before they brought it to Chicago. Elijah Muhammad contributed to the paper, but the main features dealt with other aspects of it. He'd asked me to write an article on ancient Nigeria to the present. I'd done one part of the article, but dealing with the main part, he wanted to know about the Alkebu-lanic War, because this dealt with conflict between two Muslim groups in Nigeria. They are still in Nigeria, they're still in conflict, the Hausa and the Fulani. I never got to the other part of it because little jobs and scrambled and one thing after the other. Then finally I got a job as advisor to a group going to film the march on Washington. Malcolm X had petitioned Elijah Muhammad for permission to lead his unit in this march. Permission was not given. Now, Malcolm X was outgrowing the stage of Islam. He had gone beyond the narrow program of the nation. He was champion at the bit, wanted action over and beyond what the nation could furnish him. Elijah Muhammad was often getting ill, going to live in Arizona, then in partial isolation. The fruit of Islam, built by Malcolm, had former hustlers, former jailbirds, former murderers, former con men, and opportunists who never lost their trade, though in the movement. They began to suspect that if Elijah Muhammad died, Malcolm X would be the successor. Malcolm X knew them well enough, having trained them, he knew which ones would even turn on him. They began to spread rumors within the group, within the Muslim movement, about Malcolm. Then finally came this speech, and Malcolm was answering a question. This was not even a part of his speech. After the death of Kennedy, he said something about chickens coming home to roost. The rumors about Malcolm had already reached Elijah. And Elijah suspended Malcolm for 30 days. Malcolm X's knowledge of the secretaries that Elijah Muhammad allegedly had gone with and had children by shocked Malcolm to the point where Malcolm X, who loved the old man to the extent that he wanted to even find a quote in scripture that would justify what his father had done. To Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad was the lost father that Malcolm X never had. The father that left him early in his life. He had found that father image in Elijah Muhammad, and he had addressed himself to that image, and he was loyal to that image. Now he's got a dilemma. He is partially out of the movement. He has strong following who are non-Muslim. He has strong support that is non-Muslim. He had gone beyond the nation. He had been Elijah Muhammad's spokesman in the nation. And Malcolm X, more than any other person, made that movement publicly and made it possible for that movement to sustain itself financially. He was an honest man. Instead of hustling and getting some houses on the movement, there was enough money for him to have that. He assumed that if anything happened to him, the nation would take care of him. He had miscalculated the fruit of Islam, many of them his enemies. He had also miscalculated the fact that there were members in the movement who were agents of the FBI, and it is suspected that John Ali, the National Secretary, was the main agent. The money handler. Now, a man in Elijah Muhammad's group, like John Ali, had divorced his wife and given her $75,000, quite a bit of money for a black man to have in a movement that's supposed to be a people's movement. This caused some people to have suspicion, others did not. Sylvester Leach wrote articles inferring it, but could not say it directly because he couldn't prove it. Malcolm X did not pay a great deal of attention to the rumors about John Ali. During the period of suspension, the month was almost up and no one had let Malcolm X know whether he would be able to come into the movement, back into the movement or not. Malcolm X had sent many letters to Elijah Muhammad. And finally he got no answer. He began to take messages. These messages were all, absolutely all interceded into me. Elijah Muhammad never got it. Intercepted. So therefore Malcolm X plea and Malcolm X attempt to compromise. Malcolm X telling Elijah Muhammad, we have something here that is good for a people. We should not let it be disrupted. He offered to go back into the nation and just as a preacher and to give up his other public activities, which was a great compromise indeed, which would have made Malcolm X essentially a servant to the Muslims, but not a servant to the vast number of people who respected him who were non-Muslims. It was a big compromise because it's a compromise he didn't care to make. That would cut him off from a whole lot of people. Malcolm X had been a great teacher. He had extended beyond this movement. Finally, when it became clear that he would not be invited, he came out and formed the Muslim Mosque Incorporation and the Organization for Afro-American Unity. The organization, and finally, the two organizations had a series of meetings at a restaurant in Harlem called the Flash Inn. It's an expensive restaurant, but they are not open on Saturday until the lunch hour, so we could get the space free of charge, thanks to Percy Sutton, on Saturday morning. But this is where we met. It was really here that the decision was made to call the organization, to pattern the organization after the Organization of African Unity. He literally assigned me to the task of getting the Constitution for the Organization of African Unity, and the meeting to develop the Constitution for the Organization of Afro-American Unity took place in my living room then in Leonard's Terrace. I would never, by my free will, move into a place like Leonard's Terrace. I would do something better with my money, considering the high rents that they charge. I would want a larger piece of real estate for that kind of money. My main point is, which is of no great significance, if you wonder what the hell you doing in Leonard's Terrace with a doorman and all that stuff, you remember the working class. I married into the apartment. Because the girl that I married lived in Leonard's Terrace. So I gave up my large one-room studio on 36th Street. It was a well-furnished one room with all the basic necessities. And I called it a studio because writers and intellects live in studios. Everybody came there. Arthur David to rehearse plays. Earl Hyman, who played the father on Bill Cosby Show. Belafonte looking for the folklore of songs. Irvin Burgee, who later became a leading songwriter and my daughter's godfather. different people looking for background, because the place was literally a library of information, and with myself, newspaper clippings and different information I had spoken on. People thought that I had information on, so people would come, you know, by people of caliber would come by. Diane Sand, long before she appeared in Raisin in the Sun. Lorraine Hansberry looking for information for Paul Robeson's paper, Freedom. Hal Cruz with his dull self looking for trouble to get into. The Harlem Writers Guild on the John Killing would meet there occasionally. And sometime in this big room I would give a party, 27 people or more, cook for all of them. And occasionally, only very occasionally, a Malcolm X, instead of sending for information, would come to pick it up himself, but never alone. He rarely ever did anything alone. And when he was interviewed, he always made a point of having someone else witness the interview. He's a very cautious human being, and except for coffee, and one single time after he left the movement and was busy one day, and he stopped downtown to pick up a steak and asked someone to fix it. He stood right in the kitchen and watched every move her hand made until the steak was finished. And he ate the steak. That's the only time he ate outside of the restaurant.
Yeah, I it told.
He rarely ever ate at other people's homes. He never ate anything at mine, but occasionally I could serve him some coffee. Okay, my main point is that in the Organization of African States, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, every time we struck a good chord in the wording of the Constitution, Malcolm X was like a juvenile child. That this man, with all that has been written about him, had a beautiful shyness about him, just like an obedient child in the presence of an admiring parent. And yet this man was clearer on more issues in relationship to the reality of the African world than any other person. Now, out of the nation of Islam, he would go to Africa. He would make two main trips. You have to make sure you understand what happened. In Egypt, when he was attempted to be poisoned, he knew then, and this was after the bombing of his house, he knew then that the Muslim movement in the United States could not reach this far. He knew that the FBI, other agents were out to get him. He knew the murder style of the fruit of Islam. He knew that this was not their murder style. Malcolm X had unfortunately not studied divisions within the Muslim movement of the Arabs. One group of Arabs, thoroughly corrupt and debased as a mangy dog, uses Islam commercially. Build stores all over the world, connect with other Muslims. Some of them live in Switzerland near their bank account. Two people bidding for him and he don't know either one. Unfortunately, he leaned in the wrong direction. And he leaned toward those who were also capable of being manipulated by the CIA and the FBI. Malcolm X knew the long arm of the intelligence community that extends to French intelligence, British intelligence, and the intelligence system of the colonial world, that he was facing a larger force than the fruit of Islam. On his way back, he wanted to stop in Paris. He was prevented from entering Paris. He wanted to stop in London, and he was prevented from entering London. He had gone on the Hajj. He had seen black Muslims, brown Muslims, white Muslims, all worshiping in Mecca. This was, and please hear me well, an observation. Too many people interpret this observation as meaning this is a major change in the life of Malcolm X. He is now an integrationalist. He was never an integrationalist, nor did he lean in that direction for one moment, because he gave a series of lectures at the Socialist Forum. The assumption with the socialists, mostly the Trotskyite socialists, it was that Malcolm X was leaning in that direction. Now with the doors that was open to him when he was part of the nation closed, he had to turn to other forums. He had to turn to other platforms. So the Socialist Forum, the militant forum that newspaper called the Militant, gave a series of forums because Malcolm X accepted that invitation more than some others, because there was no comparable space available to him, and he had a new kind of audience. His black audience would follow him downtown anyway, whether he spoke downtown or uptown. He had basically a black audience. Now he's got a sprinkling of white. He is calling on the whites to teach other whites who wanted to help, wanted to integrate. He's calling on them to inform other whites about our plight rather than to get directly into it. You straighten out your brother, and that will be a great help to us, other than joining them. They didn't get the point then.
They don't get it
now. Now, a man named Brightman began to put material together on Malcolm X. He's not going to use it extensively until Malcolm X is dead. White people are strategic planners. Sometimes, because we are so unsuspecting, we fall into their trap without knowing we are in their trap. Malcolm X would hold several press conferences about the thing with Elijah Muhammad. In the meantime, Malcolm X continued to try to get through to Elijah Muhammad. He continued to try to strike a compromise even after he had publicly exposed Elijah Muhammad's indiscretion with the young girl. He still thought that his role would be best served as part of the nation. He thought some kind of arrangement could be made. All right. He would go to Africa this second time. He would go to the Organization of African Unity. He would go and sit in as observers, and he would get 8 African nations to sign an agreement that they would now bring the problem of Black America to the forefront of the world community as a human rights issue other than a civil rights issue. Now you see Malcolm X writing his own epitaph. At this point, we should have put gunmen around him for protection 24 hours a day, and we should change the gunman often enough so if anyone gets an idea, he could be watched by another one. And if anyone steps out of line to try to harm him, he could be cut down by another one. We didn't have that foresight then. He continued to conduct the forum at the Audubon Theater, old ballroom that they now want to tear down, but that's still another story. He would invite Muhammad Babu, then a successful revolutionist who had brought some semblance of unity between the island of Zanzibar and Tanzania, had some success in this revolution. Babu was part Arab and part of that mixture of Arab and African that came together, but he was more African than Arab and only showed a small amount of the Arab infusion. He would invite different people to speak at different times. Some of the brothers would literally warm up the audience, and there would be basic entertainment before his speaking. Arthur Davis, who had been supportive of him, other people have been supportive of him, consistently tried to persuade him to stop people being such as they entered the hall. And also to persuade him this had something to do with his image. Finally, and people think that the suspension of the such had happened several weeks before his death. The first week he suspended this such, there were no men standing in front of the stage, some with rifles. There was no one standing on the stage looking out into the audience just in case something happened. There were no people at back, and there was no such. Malcolm X had been fatalistic about his own life. This could have been a revolutionary error that we might have to correct. When a revolutionist becomes fearful of his life, the people that he is a revolutionist about, the cause that he is a revolutionist about, should throw enough protection around him to take away his fear. They should say, if they want to kill you, they got to come through us first. And once they come through this wall of flesh, there's another one they got to come through. And the protectors of Malcolm X should let them know that if you come to take a life, bring a life with you, because we intend to take some too. Had this been well known, there could have been a justification for the removal of the such. Another unfortunate thing is that Earl Grant, who was one of Malcolm's photographers and bodyguards and personal friend, was also a sharpshooter. And had Earl Grant been on stage with his rifle, watching with those eagle eyes he had when that man stood up. He would have been on his way to his grave. But Ur would have cut him down. It would only take one shot. This man was an expert rifleman in the army, trained killer. Mild as a lamb if you leave him alone. But if you ruffle him, you got an enemy not going to be easy to deal with. Okay, he's not on stage. Nobody's watching in the back. The policeman, formerly stationed at the door or outside of the door, absent. It's hard, it may be hard for you to understand that the first opening, there have been many attempts on it, but the first opening his killers got, they used. That Malcolm X was killed the very first week the search was started. He was not killed weeks later. He was killed that very first week. A commotion started in the back. Malcolm X came out telling the brothers to cool it. This was to take while Malcolm X is focused at the back of the auditorium. Two brothers started a commotion in front and fired. Now, that's too much body action not to have been stopped. That body action could have easily been stopped had the guards been in front of the stage and two being on the stage, one being Earl Grant, the expert rifleman. Malcolm X catering to the goodness and the persuasion of a group of people, all non-Muslim, and I do not believe that any of them knew the consequence of what was going to happen, and that any of them were in the pay of any agent of assault. They were people who meant well, and people who were good friends of Malcolm, but who thought that Malcolm's image literally called for him to withdraw all of this protection and let the brothers in, because we had loved him enough that no one who came there would harm him. They had underestimated the black killers. They had underestimated blacks in the pay of whites. They underestimated the fact that Malcolm had done the unforgivable. He had shown his people the true face of power and what to do about it. This was after the bombing at Birmingham, when Martin Luther King made that terrible statement, if blood must flow, let it be our blood and not the blood of our white brothers. A direct quote.
That's crazy.
That was obscene, even vulgar.
Yep. Yep.
Martin was never been more wrong than that. That disenchantment and stick. Some of the students had grown tired of the concept of violence and nonviolence. The march at Selma, when there was a government agreement that would not be disrupted, and they ran those horses and beat the kids with billy sticks after Martin symbolically had gone on the march and returned to Atlanta. That was a violation of an agreement that the local sheriffs had made with the American government. We knew then, while Malcolm X was fatalistic about this whole thing, he expected it early, and he was saying through his verbal language and through his body language, go ahead and get it over with. He suspected that he was in a trap he couldn't get out of. This could have been an ideological mistake. It was surely a revolutionary mistake. There should have been people around Malcolm X who could have countermanded his orders and still get along with him. I don't mean be disrespectful to him in any way, but say, I'm sorry, Malcolm, you need protection and you are going to get it. And give it over his protest. But they didn't, and he was killed. He was killed, and a whole lot of people came out of the woodwork saying they were Malcolm's friends. It became the end thing to tell about your life with Malcolm, your conversations with Malcolm. So therefore I kept quiet, because I did not want to be associated with these phonies. I kept quiet about the long conversations in the back of 22 restaurants. I kept quiet about the long conversations before and after the meeting at Flash Inn. I kept quiet about the assignment he had personally given to me to look up things, and occasionally they were things not related specifically to history, but related to the black condition, when he said, John, give me a reading on this matter. And I would look up in material and read it over and said, this is my interpretation. He was not bound to accept my interpretation, but I said, my reading of the matter tells me this. He would use the part he wanted to use, and I told him, anytime you want to discard anything I give you, you don't have to call and get permission. You just go ahead and do it. Use what you think is best, discard the rest, or keep it. We do not have a kind of relationship when I'm so sensitive that you must make use of everything I give you. So it continues. Betty would tell me later on that people called Malcolm all through the day. She didn't know who some of them were, but he had left a word to her that if John calls, let me know. And he always returned the call. Sometimes at some gosh darn hour in the night when I think even God had gone to bed. And he would call sometime at 2 o'clock. He just get home. Hey, what's happening? Then he would start kidding me. You still eating pork? You still hanging out with that swine? Then after we have our little joke about my bad diet, he get to business. You know, had I paid attention to him, had I stopped sitting down to meals and sprinkling salt automatically before tasting the food, had I went on a diet of fish and fowl and left pork alone, which causes mucus, which causes pressure in the eyes. Though glaucoma is hereditary, it could have been caught early enough to have been cured. So he was right after all.
Yes, he was.
But it's too late for me to realize it when I only got 5% of my vision left. But the important thing is that Malcolm X brought to the scene of protest a directness that we had never known before. Too much has been made over the alleged difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Both men were heading in the same direction using different methods. King was using indirect methods, Malcolm was using direct methods. Malcolm was about something King was not about. Malcolm X began to have a global view of the African world. King was never a Pan-Africanist or a black nationalist in any way. King hung into the concept of the Judeo-Christian ethic, not knowing that it was the Judeo-Christian ethic that got us into the slave trade and it kept us in bondage. Malcolm X was too real to have gone down that road, although the ultimate goal of both men was for the citizenship and the basic dignity and the manhood and the womanhood of his people. White people create conflicts where there are no conflicts. And we have missed hearing our greatest messengers because white people told us that a conflict existed between them. So therefore, people began to criticize Du Bois and had never read one word of Du Bois. People began to criticize Marcus Garvey and had not even read one word of Marcus Garvey. People began to criticize Booker T. Washington's educational program and had not read any of the two books written or pulled together by Du Bois and Washington on education and did not understand these two men were not enemies. They were two men who grew up in different environments and had different points of views about the same things based on that environmental growth and that class growth. Meaning Du Bois from New England, Washington the former slave from the South and agrarian. These two men were not expected to look at the world the same way.